What's going on, guys? The 2023 Japanese Grand Prix is this weekend, and I am here to make my predictions for what is going to happen around the Suzuka circuit this weekend. It's coming off of a very exciting weekend in Singapore as we finally saw Max Verstappen and Red Bull's utter dominance of this year come to an end, and at minimum, at least briefly, as we saw Carlos Sainz win the first race of a non-Red Bull driver this season around the streets of Singapore. It was a fantastic race with a very exciting finish, some very timely safety cars and some bold strategy calls abounded, but we saw the Spaniard take the win. F1 now heads to Japan, the island of Japan, in one of my favorite circuits and one of, I think, a lot of people's favorite circuits on the calendar, Suzuka. We're going to be making our predictions in this one. We're going to be making our predictions for the biggest positive surprise, the biggest disappointment, our qualifying top three, our race podium, and finally, it wouldn't be us, it wouldn't be this channel if we didn't make our Haas predictions of the race weekend. Now, Haas had a very good weekend last week, but are they going to be able to hold on and bring and carry that momentum forward? Time will tell. I guess we'll find out. But first, let's go ahead and jump on into it. But before we do, if you enjoy F1 content, go ahead, hit that subscribe button down below, and also leave in the comments along with me what are your predictions for this weekend's race. I think it's going to be a very exciting one. Suzuka is one of my favorites. But with that said, let's go ahead, jump into our first prediction of biggest positive surprise. Starting off with biggest positive surprise, I have gone for Oscar Piastri. I think this one actually makes a whole lot of sense. I think the last couple of rounds we've seen a couple of unlucky situations for Oscar, and now that we're going to see him in potentially the same car, not even potentially, he's going to see him in the same car with the same upgrades that Lando got in Singapore, especially at a circuit where that car loves a good medium to high speed corner. I think the McLaren could shine in Japan, and I think Oscar is due for a very, very good performance, similar to what we saw in Spa in Belgium a handful of rounds ago. I think we could see Oscar kind of take another step forward in his development, especially now that he's officially extended his contract with McLaren until the end of the 2026 season. I think we could see a very good weekend, a return to form for Oscar Piastri. I think it's going to go very, very well for him, and I think we'll see him up near the top, maybe even in the top three. I guess time will tell. But Oscar, you are my pick for biggest positive surprise. Moving straight on into my biggest disappointment prediction. Now, this one, I don't always agree with the wording on it. I think it's just something of a disappointing weekend, not necessarily even trying to dog or curse anyone, to say the least. Man, I think I'm only, delaying it and kind of adding these qualifiers because I really don't want to say it out loud, that I think Kevin Magnussen might have a bit of a return to earth, as it was after Haas had a fantastic weekend in Singapore last time out with two Q3 appearances, one for each car, and a top 10 finish and a points finish for the first time since Austria. I think it could be a rare return to form, not even a rare return to form for Haas, and a circuit that I don't think is going to suit the car very well. And I think it could be a very tough weekend for Haas overall. But I think Kevin specifically, who's had a very up and down year, coming off of probably maybe his best weekend of the year, finishing in the points once again for the first time in a very long time. I think it could be a short-lived on top of the mountain. And so, unfortunately, Kevin, you are my pick for biggest disappointment. Moving on now to my qualifying top three, and we have, I think, a very good mix, and I think we could see a lot of this, and I could actually see myself getting this one bang on. Starting out with P3, I have gone for Carlos Sainz. Carlos has been driving absolutely incredibly since we got back from the summer break, even taking the win, like I mentioned, in Singapore last weekend. I think Carlos is driving with a lot of confidence right now in a car that apparently is just continually vibing with him as we've gotten back from the summer break. I mean, we saw it that he ran almost a perfect race in Singapore, really managed it well, and really had the pace when he needed to. Is he going to carry that forward into Suzuka? I think so. I mean, the guy is driving with a lot of confidence and a lot of pace and a lot of focus for sure as he continues to try and fight and battle for points and race wins and podiums as the season has gone on. He's been in an absolute unreal form, and I think we could see it continue around Japan. I think the Ferrari is definitely pushing to try and potentially catch up to both Aston Martin and Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship, and I think Carlos could potentially lead them on their charge forward, as Charles has really had a bit of a tough run of form these last handful of rounds. And so Carlos, I think, finishes P3 from qualifying and hopefully can carry it forward from there. Moving on to P2. I mentioned this papaya colored car before in my biggest positive surprise prediction, but it is actually going to be the other driver of Lando Norris. I think Lando has been a qualifying machine, and even in the race last week also ran very, very good and ran very good pace. And that car, I think, is just going to do so well around Suzuka. And so I think Lando is actually going to put it on the front row behind my pick for pole position, Max Verstappen. I mean, I don't know what he's going to do to us as viewers this weekend. I think it could get ugly, and it could get ugly fast, especially getting away from the technical low to medium speed corners of Singapore to the medium to high speed corners at a circuit, a track specific circuit like Suzuka. I think this could be an utter domination from Red Bull. And so I think Max is going to put it on pole. I'm not even sure it's going to be particularly close. I think if any, the McLaren might be able to battle it a little bit, but it's all going to come down to what the performance that Lando is able to put in, at least in terms of my predictions. So I'm interested to see what happens, but I think this could be a very long weekend for those of us who are hoping for a potential back-to-back non-Red Bull win. But from here, all we can do is make our predictions, and I think Max is going to put it on pole, and I don't think it'll be particularly close. Moving on now to the race podium. I mentioned this in my qualifying predictions, but I think it could be a very good day for a select few number of cars. And I think we'll start now with P3. My choice for the third step of the podium, Oscar Piastri. That's right. I think that Oscar is going to make his way forward. I don't necessarily think he's going to qualify that far back, so this won't be much of a charge forward to a podium, but I do think that he'll do enough to have good enough pace to finish on the podium in this one. It'll be a very, very good result for Oscar, especially after the last couple of rounds where he's been really just the bearer of bad luck more than anything these last couple of rounds, although in Singapore he did make his way into the points from P17. So I think he's been on a pretty solid run of form, but I think if he can put it together in qualifying and do all the right things around a circuit like Suzuka, I can see Oscar finishing on the podium. Moving on to P2, I have gone for the Scuderia Ferrari driver, Carlos Sainz. Echoing pretty much everything I said in qualifying prediction, I think Carlos is driving absolutely unreal right now, and I think if he can continue on with the confidence and the pace that he's had in that car, I think the Ferrari could be potentially positioned to make some decent calls this weekend. And I think if all things go right for them, I think I could see Carlos finishing on the second step of the podium. Although, who knows, because I think it's all going to come down to what happens for my next pick, my winner of the Japanese Grand Prix, Max Verstappen. I don't think anybody's too shocked by this, and I also, as I mentioned a couple of times already, I think this could get ugly, and it could get ugly fast if Max comes out as angry as he seemed after Singapore. He's all weekend long, he is expressing his frustrations at just how the car wasn't working around Singapore. And once you take that car and you put it in a track like Suzuka, which I think that Red Bull will be absolutely dominant at, I think this could get ugly, but who knows? Can you imagine the scenes? Imagine with me now. Close your eyes. Picture in your mind a second weekend in a row where Red Bull doesn't run away with the whole thing, and we actually get a decent battle for the win, especially in front of a crowd and the fans like they have out in Japan. I think it could be an all-time race weekend if it were to happen. And while I don't necessarily think it will happen, it's always fun to dream, and it could get also very spicy if for some reason Red Bull just finds themselves off the pace a little bit. I think time will tell. I think we'll learn very, very quickly, potentially even like pre-practice 1, whether or not this might be the case. But for now, we're just going to make our predictions based on what we think is going to happen. And I think, Max, you are going to win the Japanese Grand Prix to potentially restart another Red Bull streak of wins. And then we round out my predictions with my Haas prediction of the race weekend. And now, I know that during Biggest Disappointment, I spent a good chunk of time talking about how the Haas car may not necessarily be as good for Suzuka as one might think. That said, though, one of the drivers had a very good weekend last weekend, and one of the drivers last weekend had a very good weekend that kind of trailed off towards the end. I think Nico is going to come out and absolutely come out with a fire under him in Japan. And I think he's going to actually put in a very good result around Japan. And while I don't think it ends in a points finish, I do think he'll make it into Q3. And so my official predictions for Haas are 1 car into Q2, 1 car into Q3, but unfortunately I don't think it'll come from points unless something crazy happens, but it's so hard to predict a big pileup or a big crash or a perfectly timed safety car. And so I think Nico will come out with a lot of pace. I really hope he does. It would be great to see him back on form like we've seen him in qualifying a few times this year. But I think it'll be a very great run in qualifying. But just as we've seen so many times this season, a great qualifying performance doesn't always lead to points for Haas. And so I think they'll fall out. And while I do think it'll be, an upper half of the bottom half finish, I just don't think that car has enough race pace at a circuit like Suzuka to really make it happen. But I think qualifying could be a very, very good opportunity for Haas to continue to learn, gather data, and try and make the best car they can for next season. But there you go. Those are my predictions for the Japanese Grand Prix this weekend. I'm super excited to see it. I mean, Japan last year was an odd one with the weather. It was the first time I decided to stay up and try and watch it live. But of course, with the weather delay, I'm pretty sure I fell asleep literally as the race actually restarted for the last 30 minutes or about whatever it ended up being. So I'm excited to be up and watch it again live. It's going to be a fun one. I really like Japan and in that circuit and seeing the cars go around there. So I'm excited to see what happens. I'm daydreaming of a Red Bull struggle fest, but I don't think it's going to happen. Personally, I think Red Bull is going to come out very angry and determined to reassert themselves at the top. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments below. And now we are actually going to move into a rearranging of this video a little bit. If you've been here before, typically I also allow my community to make their predictions, and I'll usually do it after each individual section. For this one, we're doing it a little bit differently, as I'm going to do all of my community predictions at the end. I think it'll just flow a little bit better, and we'll be able to just kind of roll through them a little easier. Let's go ahead and let's start right back at the top. Biggest positive surprise for my community. They have a split decision of Oscar Piastri and Ferrari. I think a lot of us are pretty expectant of McLaren to do very well, and I think Lando has been on a very good run of form, as does my community, and so they think Oscar is just kind of rise back up to meet Lando. We've seen them be very on the pace with each other at certain circuits this year, and I think Japan could be another one of those where we see them very close to each other and around the same pace. And so I think we're expecting big things from Pastry this weekend, and we're excited to see. The other pick of Ferrari, I think this kind of goes along with the expectance of Carlos keeping on form, and Charles kind of exactly the same as Oscar, kind of rising up to meet Carlos. And so while I don't think Charles has necessarily been bad, it's just hard to compare them exactly the same right now, when Carlos seems to have had the pace a lot of the time and has had some very, very good finishes, while Charles has had some struggles the last few rounds. So they have some belief in Oscar and Ferrari, and it's pretty easy to see why. Moving on to biggest disappointment, we have an inverse. We have a pick of Ferrari and a pick of Aston Martin. I think it's definitely fair to say that Aston Martin has struggled in some of these medium to high speed circuits, and so I think it's a pretty easy pick to see exactly what's going to happen, especially with Stroll. And it's curious to know exactly what his confidence is going to look like going into this weekend after the big shunt that he had in qualifying around Singapore. Is he truly back up to 100%? Time will tell. And I just don't think that Aston Martin car is going to do well enough around Japan to really make a big impression. So it's pretty easy to see. And I think the pick for biggest disappointment of Ferrari, I think that one also is it's also easy to see that Ferrari could end up making just a wrong strategy call or a wrong choice. Something goes wrong for Ferrari at their peak, it seems like. So that's a pretty easy one to see as well. Moving on to their qualifying results. They have both chosen Max Verstappen as their pole sitter. I think that one also very easy to see. In P2, we have a pick of Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton, one over the other. It's so hard to predict with Checo right now, just because of what we're seeing out of him recently is just it's not on, and it's so hard to predict him to be up there, just because he just hasn't had the pace that Max has had in that car. George, I think, had a very good weekend in Singapore all the way up, and he had a good 99.5% of Singapore until literally the last lap of the race. And so I think he'll come out fiery, and hopefully... Also, I said George. I meant Lewis. Lewis actually had a very good weekend in Singapore outside of a little bit of qualifying. Apologies, I read the wrong line. And so I think they think Lewis will come out with a little bit of pace around him as well in a Mercedes that I don't think necessarily has been as good in those medium to high speed corners, but I think Lewis is driving absolutely very well right now in an effort to keep pushing. And then P3, we'll just roll through it really quickly. Sainz and Leclerc, a Ferrari second row, P3 in qualifying. Take your pick, really. I think Ferrari, that slots in about where you would expect a Ferrari, so it really just comes down to whether it's going to be Sainz or Leclerc. Now, moving ahead to the race podium, and we'll just get it out of the way. Max Verstappen win. Pretty obvious pick. I don't think any of us had really disagreed when we were talking about it earlier. Where they start to differ is in P2. One has Checo Perez also running away and keeping at P2. And then the other side, we have a pick of George Russell, echoing exactly what I said when I read him for the wrong prediction. George is going to want to come out and put in a very good weekend, considering he was so close to a very good result for himself around Singapore. And so I think I could easily see this happening as well. And then P3, Lewis Hamilton, Oscar Piastri. I mean, it seems like there's a very select few number of drivers that we could see finish on the podium here, but it's also a good mix of drivers. It's not necessarily the same ones every single time out. So very, very happy to see and excited to see what actually does come down by the time that the race is done. And then lastly, for their Haas predictions, they predict a P12 and a P14 and a P13 and a P16. So pretty much exactly the same as me, kind of that upper to mid, lower half of the field in the race. The car just doesn't have pace. It's pretty easy to see. And while qualifying can be a big W, it's so hard to see them with the race pace because that car just doesn't have it. But guys, there you have it. My predictions and our predictions for the Japanese Grand Prix this weekend. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. Go ahead, hit subscribe. We'll be here for after the race is over to go over what happened in the race, my weekend winners and losers, as well as go over the predictions I just made. So keep an eye out for that after the race weekend concludes. And yeah, that's going to do it for me in this one, guys. So until then, I'll see you in the next one.